another episode of In Depth with Dion. This episode is sponsored by Afropop Company, a craft soda company blending bold flavors and cultural pride made right here in Oklahoma, Oklahoma's only Black-owned soda company. In this episode, I speak with Kaysa Whitley, a coordinator for Westwin Resistance, about her efforts to defend tribal sovereignty and to stop a toxic refinery from polluting her community. But first, the rundown. In local news, a Black content creator went viral after she shared a video of a white woman assaulting her at a dog park with no charges from Tulsa police. But her decision not to fight back has resulted in backlash on social media. In state news, an OKC woman and her 3 daughters were left traumatized and penniless after ICE agents and other federal agents raided her home looking for someone else, taking all of her life savings and other possessions. And in national news, nearly 8 decades after serving their country overseas, the trailblazing Black women of the 688 are finally receiving the nation's highest civilian award, the Congressional Gold Medal. The 688 Central Postal Directory Battalion, the only all-Black, all-female unit to serve in Europe during World War II, was responsible for breaking through a paralyzing mail crisis that threatened to collapse troop morale. And those are some of the headlines. This is In Depth with Dion. I'm your host, Dion Osborne, recording from Tulsa's historic Greenwood District. Up next, you'll hear from Kaysa Whitley. All right, I'm super excited today to have Kaysa Whitley on In Depth with Dion. Kaysa, the leader of Westwin Resistance down in KCA, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache land, or so-called Lawton, Oklahoma. Thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I like that when it started, we both were like, oh, let's be serious.
Right? Oh my gosh. So, I don't even know where to start because you are a fire brand. You are seriously you are the kind of person that I want to see running for city council in Lawton because you have the information, the data, you have the motivation to educate your community. It's really the support. That's all that they're not really fully giving to you. And I want to start by asking you, when it comes to Westwin Resistance, why did this group form? Can you explain it for the people who maybe don't really know what's going on in Lawton?
Yeah. So firstly, I definitely would like to run for city council at some point. My goal is to try to get somebody elected as mayor after Stan, only because I still want to go and get my college degree. There's still stuff that's left unanswered with Westwin. And I feel like serving on some sort of dais, because I am young, would maybe help people feel a little more comfortable with having somebody as young as I am in office. But so definitely looking to run at some point. Line ain't ready for me yet, though. They will be, but they're not quite there yet. But Weston basically, we all, I guess, formed initially around really one issue, which is that we are fighting the first critical elements refinery that is being proposed in the United States, well, so-called United States. So basically what happened was my friend, Ash, who I had met through organizing, politically and then through MMIP, would kind of always, yeah. So we'd always kind of I guess been around the same circles, and we'd always had a friendship, and we always wanted to work together, but there was just never really an opportunity that presented itself until Ida's Law. And so, yes, for those who don't know, MMIP does stand for Missing and Murdered Indigenous People. You might also see words like MMIW or MMIR that also go around until it's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives. So really the reason why those entities exist is because Indigenous people, but specifically Indigenous women and non-binary persons, experience violence at 2 times a higher rate than almost any other group. So what happened was that we weren't really getting any help, like solving our own missing persons cases. And so our tribes and our women really stepped up and started forming these MMIW groups and taking on that role of like solving basically the role of investigator and started like essentially trying to get families closure. So when Ida's law came around, it would essentially facilitate one like position for the OSBI to put someone in that would allow them to create a database for MMIW cases. So I had met Ash like really got to know her like through that experience. And then I ended up moving back down to Lawton, and then I've been here ever since. So we always were separated by space. And then when Westwin came about, she basically just put like a bunch of people in the room that she thought would be interested in organizing around Westwin. And I guess I was one of them. And then really, honestly, like I'm I am the coordinator, so I guess in a sense, like, and honestly, like, if people ask for an interview or if you ask a question, like, people would definitely like turn to me, and as someone to answer those questions or to do that interview. But I wouldn't say that I'm a leader in like the traditional like colonial sense. That's why my title isn't anything like president or CEO or like anything like that, because ultimately I believe in autonomy. And so really I just coordinate for the coalition. So everything that I do, it's always something that we have discussed as a group and said, yes, like this is something we want to move forward on. But so it really, when I got involved, it was just around curiosity and concern, like in regards to the critical elements refinery. And then we all just kind of like fell into a flow, which is really something that's very rare for coalitions, especially in these, like to be just thrown together by someone. And in these types of organizing spaces, really, it's very rare to have that cohesive type of feeling from the beginning. But honestly, I think we maybe had like one or two like problem childs, and we just got them together real quick, and then we've been fine ever since, and we've just been kicking. But so it's one of those things where, like yes, technically I am the leader, but I'm not the leader. Or I guess I should say I'm not like authoritarian. Nay, I really am just kind of the face. But yeah, having that cohesive feeling was definitely something that I was excited about. And then honestly, we've just been working together to raise awareness about what's happening.
Of course. And, me and my colleague, Brittany Cordera, we have been taking turns reporting on your efforts over the past, I want to say it's been over a year now,
Yeah, it
right?
has been.
Since, this has all started. And so there's so many issues. There's so much to unpack. But at the end of the day, I feel like what it comes down to is a lack of transparency when it comes to the city's decision to support this project financially without really giving the residents of Lawton or surrounding areas or tribal communities whose ancestral lands will be impacted by this project really any say in whether it happens or not.
Yeah. It definitely is. The lack of transparency is definitely a huge concern, not just on the city's behalf, though, but also on Weston's behalf. Really, honestly, if the city would have involved the citizens from the beginning, if they would have legitimately addressed citizens' concerns and actually like went down a path that would lead to some sort of resolution, then like my job literally would not exist right if Westwin had decided to really like include the people of Lawton and not just depend on the city entities, then I personally think that a lot of the negative aspects of this could have been avoided. Um, I don't know that I would have ever been on the same side, only because I am very like anti-industry at my core.
Mhm.
So I can't say that I would ever have like approved of Westwin coming. But what I will say is that had either entity actually like engaged in transparent discourse, then I do feel like a lot of the times when we've had to kind of butt heads with them, we really never would have had to. I personally think that um, the way that our city is set up, it's not really set up to encourage discourse or to really encourage any sort of like movement. In my opinion, it's basically set up so that everybody's holding a piece of the pie, but nobody's really holding the whole pie at the end. So what I mean by that is like when it comes to liability, basically it's like they kind of change it and it changes interdepartmentally, the responsibility does. So at the end of the day, when we actually go to like get answers, it's like we're never really able to get legitimate answers from anyone because no one is holding all of the pieces of the puzzle. Everyone is only holding their own piece. And personally, I believe that that's intentional. I believe that that's the way that the system is set up so that when it comes to accountability, um, the system is set up to essentially allow our city ways to skirt accountability because to them accountability is liability.
I want to ask for people who don't really understand why this is a problem, inside or outside of the city, what are the specific concerns when it comes to Westwind finishing this refinery?
Yeah. So we definitely have a lot of concerns. I personally, I mean, how much time do we really have to be on? Because I could sit here for a whole hour talking to you about my concerns. What I will say is that we definitely have a lot of environmental concerns. So Westwind, well, okay. So I guess I should start with saying that when Westwind first came to the city, they were partnered with a company called CVMR. So it stands for Chemical Vapor Metallurgy Refining. And so essentially what it is it's a bunch of businesses or entities that work under one incorporation and they all work toward the same goal of like refining. So they would create processes and apparatuses for refining materials. And it could be anything. But essentially what happened was they had this grand idea, Westwin and CVMR did, where essentially CVMR has patented technology, so they own the patents in the US and Canada for a closed loop processing system for nickel and cobalt and the apparatus for both. And so essentially, they have the patented technology and they've been working in the field for like 40, almost 40 years or something like that. So about almost 4 decades worth of experience in the field of refining and metallurgy. So essentially, you then have Westwin, who has 0 years of experience in the field. This project in Lawton would, in fact, be their first project. The CEO has no experience in refining or metallurgy. She's not an engineer. She's not a scientist. She doesn't really have any experience in the field. And for me personally, why me and Ross doing the same thing? A, for me personally, it's one of those things where it's like I'm a girl's girl at heart. I would always root for women. I want all women to win. And so I don't like being the person to essentially have to say this woman is unqualified.
Mm.
But what I will say is that when it comes to the safety of an entire people, whether she was a woman or not, I would want somebody in that position who has experience in the field of metallurgy, refining, engineering, chemistry, literally anything that shows me that she legitimately understands what she is doing, that she understands the depth of knowledge that it takes to run something like this, and that she has the depth of knowledge that it takes to essentially mitigate anything that could go wrong.
That part.
Contingency is very important in fields like this. So I feel like if we take gender out of the equation, the reality is whether she was a man, a non-binary person, whether she was trans, straight, whatever, like I do not care how she identifies. I give a fuck that she doesn't know what she's doing. Like that's what bothers me.
Yeah.
But on top of that, what you also have is that what they're working to do now, so they've kind of completed one aspect of it, so they do semi have a refinery built.
Mhm.
What it is it's like a demonstration plant. So if you are meeting with funders and you want to give them a sample of what you have like refined as like proof of concept, you
Mhm.
would do it at this facility. If you have students who are learning to work the machinery, things like that. So it's more of like an R&D facility and not necessarily more of like a production facility.
I see.
So the plan though is for them to eventually move to full scale. And so the what we're finding out is that usually the main like route that someone would take in this would be to start with nickel,
Mm.
because when you are refining metals, you start with nickel and then you just add an apparatus to the apparatus, and then essentially now you can refine cobalt or now you can refine copper. You take that off and you put something else on, and now you can refine manganese or tungsten.
Mm.
But so no matter what, the base is always going to be the apparatus that refines nickel. So that's why a lot of these entities, what you'll see is that the standard practice is for them to start there and then branch out to whatever they want their expertise to be. Well, what we know from the very beginning is that when Westwin came, our city officials were pushing for them to refine cobalt. So literally the way that the redevelopment agreement, so the agreement that our city officials and Westwin came to, was that it would allow Westwin the ability to discover their I or actually the way that it's written is it gives them the capability to discover their ability to refine nickel, cobalt, and then it says other critical elements.
Mm.
So we know that from the very beginning, cobalt was a part of the conversation. In fact, one of the things that Kaylee, the CEO for Westwind, literally like pushed her whole like um I guess I want to call it a scheme, but I guess her business plan, like
Scheme.
the whole yeah, literally. But the whole like bottom line of it was we should be like domesticating the critical elements supply chain because China is bad. Grr, like the Dominican Republic is bad. Look what they're doing to the Congolese. Grr, I
Mm.
have such a big heart. Oh, I love Jesus. He called me to help.
Literally.
Um, so it's like like, but I'm not kidding. Like I encourage you all to look it up because I'm literally quoting her right now. So what I will say is that, regardless of whatever like story she was pushing at the time, Cobalt was a part of it from the beginning. And so what we find out is that essentially, our city greenlit for her to start like trying to refine cobalt. And then eventually, like their plan, it's like a staged plan, but basically it goes pilot plant, and then the very next thing is a full scale commercial refinery. And they claim that it's not jumping directly to a commercial scale because in the redevelopment, it's like they have to build an administration building, and then they have to like build a parking lot, and they have to build this and that, and they have to raise this amount of money, and they have to get this. But what I'm telling you is that the next time that they break ground
Mhm.
and it's any sort of a refinery, it will be a full scale or commercial refinery.
Mhm. So let me ask you.
Um,
Let me ask you this: like, one of the things that they've been continuing to Westwind has been continuing to say, and Mayor Booker, Lawton Mayor Booker has been continuing to say, is that this is a safe project. There are things in place to monitor levels of pollutants in the air, land, and water. But we've already had issues when it comes to, even before Westwin was breaking ground on the pilot project, there was toxic levels in the water that the Oklahoma Department the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality sent a letter to Lawton saying, "Hey, y'all got to do something about this."
Mm-hmm.
And then most more recently, we're talking about a facility that houses potentially toxic chemicals. If if for instance a tornado blew past and destroyed it and everything was just released into the air, they're saying that it's a tough enough facility. But you called attention to the fact that the big W on the building was halfway falling off after recent storms. So my question is, how can they prove this is safe? And what has been the response from people in the community?
Okay, so no, you're good. I just wanted to finish what I was saying earlier, which is that the next time that they start building, it will be a commercial scale. And what we found out via the lawsuits that got filed is that, like, refining cobalt on a commercial scale has literally not been proven up until this point. The only thing that's been proven to be, like, quote unquote safe is like nickel, and they've done like huge nickel refineries. So they've been able to prove that that can be done. But they've not been able to prove that cobalt can be done. And so when we've spoken to our city officials, what our city officials have said is that they're giving them the leeway to essentially establish their ability to prove that they can do it safely. Yeah, so they have no concerns of this being done safely, or that I don't know, that Westwin's not gonna get it wrong at some point. Like, I mean, everybody makes mistakes along the way. So I feel like our city is not addressing that. But that's one of the huge like safety concerns that we have. As for why our city officials believe that they can say that it's like a safe project, honestly, I don't know, because literally nothing about this has been proven on a commercial scale. But also like even just like location wise, where Lawton is located is literally like in the middle of Tornado Alley. And so we do have issues with like their building not being able to withstand the winds. And it wasn't even just the W. If you look underneath the W, the shell of the building actually took damage because what I think happened was the W fell and essentially like hit the building underneath it. Which doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal when you're thinking about it in the grand scheme of things. But what you also have to remember is that that could have been anything. Like that entire area is literally industrial. And so anything could have come flying through there and it could have put a hole in the shell of that building. And the reality is that that building is supposed to be under zero pressure. It's supposed to be under negative pressure. So if I personally believe that it's a safety concern that if that shell of the building had it gotten a hole in it on a wall, we got lucky because the wall that it fell on is a wall that's not, it's where the loading area is, so it's not on the actual facility where the zero pressure or the negative pressure is. But if something like that had flown and had hit the facility on one of the walls that's within the negative pressure space, that to me is very concerning because now essentially what you have is untreated air releases. So it's definitely one of our huge concerns. Not to mention that, like, or what I was saying is that it's not just the winds that you have to be cautious about with things like this on a commercial scale. The reality is that every building has to have what's known as like a thermal oxidizer. And so with these thermal oxidizers, essentially what should be happening is that if for some reason one of their detectors goes off and says, hey, beep, 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 carbon monoxide in the air, carbon dioxide, whatever, then essentially all of the airflow to the building is pushed through the thermal oxidizers. And it's essentially like a shit ton of heat, like a dragon's breath hits that. And then it's supposed to essentially instead of it will separate the chemicals. So instead of having like nickel dioxide in the air, you would now have nickel and dioxide. And eventually it'll push that back out into the community. And so what we found out was that one of Westwin's machines was not actually turning on in emergency mode.
Excuse me?
Yeah. And so when I tried to report that, I first called OSHA, and OSHA was like, that's not us, that's ODEQ. So I was like, okay. So I called ODEQ, and ODEQ was like, that's not us, that's OSHA. So I was like,
Oh my
okay. So
gosh.
I call OSHA again, and I'm like, listen, this is one of y'all's jobs. Somebody needs to do something. So who is it gonna be? Can y'all talk to each other? Like, does it have to be me being the go between, or like, can y'all figure this out?
Right.
And so one of our safety concerns is one, that there seems, because this has never really been done before, there doesn't really seem to be any real regulating bodies in place. It's mostly like ODEQ's job is really to show up once something happens, now that Westwin is up and running. Um, they really don't prevent anything from going wrong. So they're more like responsive, not necessarily like trying to keep things from happening.
Right.
So the fact that there's like this confusion between the governing, or I guess what should be like the regulating entities, as to far as like who's regulating what, is a concern. But also on a commercial scale, every single building will have to have a thermal oxidizer, and will more than likely have to have two, not necessarily because of the size of the buildings, but because you always want at least two for contingency. So if one of those thermal oxidizers goes down, has to be replaced. If it, we have to do maintenance on it to see, like, if it's running properly, it has to get shut down. And so if that gets shut down and you have only one, then essentially you have all of that untreated releases. So you always want to have two. And so that means every single like building would have at least two thermal oxidizers, and all thermal oxidizers create essentially a warm up draft. And so we live in the middle of Tornado Alley. And so when you're thinking about it, like right now, because our gravel and our pavement gets so hot in the summer and in the spring and in the fall, it's not an issue. But when we're in the winter and the air is cold, and you are now putting out warm updrafts into the community, there is a concern now that this could potentially be causing like a flare up of winter storms for everyone who's downwind of us.
So not only is the danger from what could happen to the facility if a storm takes place, there's a danger of what the facility could create if this is released.
Correct.
Jeez.
And we got to meet with our city officials and talk to him about that. And do you know what his response was to me?
The
Oh,
mayor's?
does it? I don't know. I didn't know it did that. And no, it was Richard Rogowski. So when Westerners came, and pretty much every city is set up similarly. So if there is a project that is in your community and you're wanting to kind of get to the bottom of who's doing it, what you're going to want to look at is not just city council. They do work with somebody, but they also will usually have a trust. Like a trust or an authority that they put together to essentially work on behalf of the city. So what you're going to look at is for like economic development authorities or economic development corporations. And then your county will also have one. So like for us, it's the Comanche County Industrial Development Authority. So those three entities, your city's industrial development, your county's industrial development, and then city council will always work together. So when I say that it was our city officials, what it was LIDA's executive director, which is the Lawton Economic Development Authority, who is supposed to be like the Westwin expert. If you approach our city for anything about Westwin, they will always point you in the direction of Richard Rogowski or Brad Cooksey, because they essentially are the masterminds or the Westwin experts. But this man literally looked me in my eye and told me that he did not know that the thermal oxidizers caused warm up drafts.
That's alarming. That's alarming.
Yeah.
And y'all
But
have, oh, go ahead.
Oh, but then wanted to argue with my friend and was like, well, the pavements and stuff get hot, so it shouldn't matter, and blah, blah, blah. And David was like, well, what about the winter? And he was like, and I'm like, the silence was loud.
Oh my God. That's like the former congressman the former Oklahoma Senator Jim Inhofe, who brought a snowball to the Senate floor saying that climate change isn't real because there's snow outside.
That part.
And they're supposed to be the expert on Westland safety and all that, regulations and all that.
That part.
What have, I mean, y'all have been organizing communities, y'all have been having town halls. Even on the tribal side, y'all have gone to tribal meetings, had town halls with the Comanche Nation. I want to say the Kiowa tribe did put out a resolution opposing Westland. Isn't that right?
So technically, so when the Indigenous people were being forcefully relocated and they were essentially all pushed down to what's known as Indian Territory. In the area of so-called Lawton, those so-called boundaries were established by a treaty called the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867. And so essentially what it was it named the area specifically, like it draws the borders, the outlines, and it says these areas are going to be set aside in its Indian territory and it'll be set aside for farmlands because basically that was the trade that they wanted us as Indigenous people to pick up. First of all, we was farming before y'all bitches even got here. Second of all, but essentially like when the treaty was established, a lot of the tribes had still been working together. And so the three, like, they call them the big three, but really what it was that they were the ones who had banded together and were able to essentially, like, be the last one standing. So that was the Kiowas, Comanches, and Apaches. And so a lot of people seem to think that like the treaties came about because the tribes were weak and like, the US just really wanted to like end the war with us and stuff like that, which partially true. The government did want to end the war with us, but it's not because we were weak. It's because they were trying to build the fucking railroad and we were fucking their shit up and we would not stop. And so they put a clause in there that says, all right, if we let y'all have this area and we leave you the fuck alone, will you please stop having these like raiding parties on our railroad workers? And so we were like, I mean, I guess. And so essentially, like a lot of the land allotments for that time were left to the Kiowas, Comanches, and Apaches because of the way that the treaty was written. It was written essentially with all three entities as one. So a lot of our land allotments in the area actually still belong to all three of the tribes, which resulted in them having what they call like the KCA Land Use Committee. So that's Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache. So we have definitely done a lot of like organizing via the tribes. Basically, we did a lot of research and we started going back and watching like when Westwin first came to City Hall. When Westwin was first proposed, I wasn't a part of Westwin Resistance. Westwin Resistance didn't exist until a year after the project had already been proposed at the city. But what it was that people in the area were just organizing separately. And so we were kind of the entity that just brought them all under one roof, if you will. So we have people within our organization who have been like organizing from the beginning. But we also have people like me who didn't join until a year later. And so what I did was, or what I'm doing with the coalition's help is that we're trying to put together like essentially a like timeline, if you will, of how these things went down and how it happened. That way, when people are looking at this, they could be like, how long did this happen, or whatever. There's something for them to reference. So when we started like working on this, because we've been working on it for like over a year, but when we started working on it, that's when we started going back and watching the city council meetings. And what we found was the former Comanche chairman, Mark Lumaboya, he went to City Hall and he essentially went up there and was like, I just want to say that okay. So what you have to know is that there was a gentleman named Aquarion who went up there before Mark. And he essentially made the point that the city officials are essentially allowing themselves to take out shares within Westwin. And yeah, like, this is what he was saying. Now, what I can say is that I've been able to verify that the city through Lita does have shares within Westwin, but none of the city officials themselves
Mm.
that I know of have shares. But what he said was that essentially, like, y'all are letting yourselves take out shares in Westwin, and like, you're not inviting any of us to the table. So why is it that you're looking out for yourself, but you're not looking out for us? What if we wanted to invest in Westwin? Like, why weren't we approached? And so essentially, like, it kind of outlandish, but he was trying to make a point that essentially citizens weren't being involved at a fundamental level the way that our city officials were. And so what he said was like, why weren't we invited to the table? So when Mark went up there, what you'll hear him say is, I just wanted to say that on behalf of the Comanche people, thank you for inviting us to the table, or thank you for allowing us to have a seat at the table, or something like that was what he said. And then he essentially went on to say that what's good for the Comanche Nation people, or what's good for the city of Lawton is good for the Comanche Nation people.
Whoa, what?
Yeah.
That's what he said as the Comanche chairman.
Mm-hmm.
Good God.
Yeah. So we aired that shit out immediately. And when I tell you them Comanche aunties snatched his shit up, they snatched him up quick. And so that's how we actually got the meeting with Westwin when we were able to have Brandon Parker do his presentation. And when you see her, like, essentially tell us that she's denying our sovereignty, and that she's not going to halt construction until a consultation is done. So the only reason why that meeting happened was because we called out Mark. That was one of the things that he put together. He essentially had to put out a public apology. And so if you listen, what he says is that he's going to put together a meeting with Westwin and ODEQ, and that he's going to allow the citizens to ask questions, and that he wants us to ask questions and not fearmonger. So he never got ODEQ. What I will say is that our city officials and our tribal leaders have all said that ODEQ was going to report front and center and answer our questions, and like they literally never have. So I don't really know what the deal is with that. But we got that meeting from Mark. And then essentially the Comanches censured him right after that. And so we got a new Comanche chairman in. But in between when Mark was censured and when the Comanche chairman censured, the vice chair stepped up, Cornell Pee Wee Wardy. And so he wrote a resolution and then put it before the CBC, and the CBC voted to pass it. And it was a resolution that stood against Westwin. After that, the Apaches then passed a resolution that almost mirrored what the Comanches, it was basically like, let me copy your answers, but I'm going to change it so they don't really know.
Right.
But we know. And then after that, it was a whole thing with the Kiowa chairman. Like, we had to really like rough him up a little bit, and then he quietly passed it. He never told us that it was even under review or nothing. And then all of a sudden it was just posted on the page as something that had passed. But it was a resolution that was standing against Westwin. So eventually we got to a point where all three tribes have actually like passed resolutions, essentially like denying Westwin and not supporting it. But we've not really seen any organizing outside of that to keep Westwin from coming. Really, we have two tribal officials. So the former vice chairman of the Comanches, Cornell Pee Wee Wardy, he has fully supported us from the beginning. In fact, when that resolution got passed from the Comanches, he went to City Hall and he basically got up there and was like, I just wanted to say, yeah, we meant what we said when we passed that resolution. And then he just left. And I was like, okay, Cornell, let her know you said what you said. And then the new chairman for the Comanches, he has been extremely communicative and has always been willing to not just make time to meet with me, but to also like allow me resources that were previously being denied. So it's been extremely helpful. We've definitely, I feel like because of the craziness that our city officials have been doing lately, we've been getting a lot more of, and because of the lawsuits that came out where they basically confirmed everything we'd been alleging from the beginning, I feel like we've been getting a lot more community support, but that also means that the city officials are a lot less likely to help us.
Right.
So I do feel like it's kind of swayed that way, as before they were really willing to help us in the city, and then the community just thought we were all crazy. But now it's like we're getting a lot of community support, and the city's like, boo,
We
they're
don't want
shutting us
this.
tomatoes. Like they're just shutting us down everywhere.
Oh my goodness. So I have a couple more questions, and I want to know what's next for Westwin Resistance, for the movement. But I also want to know more about you. So I'm trying to think of the order I want to ask. Why don't we start? Let's leave what's next for the end. I want to get more into who is Kaysa.
Okay.
You have a history of speaking up for people and making enemies of administration. Um,
Yeah.
Talk about your background and why did you become an organizer?
Hmm. Well, I think a part of I think that there's a genetic component that goes into a lot of it. I told you I'm Kiowa and absentee Shawnee. So I'm actually a direct descendant of Chief Tecumseh on my absentee side, and then Chief Sethainte or White Bear on my Kiowa side. And so that's actually who Sethainte is, who represented the Kiowa people at the signing of Medicine Lodge Treaty. So I do feel like there is a genetic component in the sense that my ancestors were like famed orators, and I do feel like they live through me. But I also just feel like I feel like as Indigenous people in general, like from a really young age, we're brought up with a very strong like moral code in a sense of like what's wrong and what's right. And we're really taught about like community responsibility
Mm,
from a very young age. Not just about like protecting each other, but also understanding that what we do as Indigenous people is not just reflective of us individually, but as a whole, because there's not a ton of Indigenous representation. And so everything that we do affects how we are perceived as a whole. So we're really taught like that's like really inbred in us at a young age. And I honestly feel like I really didn't set out to become an organizer. I think I just have a very strong sense of like what's right and what's wrong. And I also know how we should do it. And so if you're going to do it right, go ahead. But if you're not going to do it right, move on
I'm gonna let you
and
go.
let me do it.
Yeah.
But I just feel like a lot of the times that I've been put in positions where I have had to organize or where I've had to essentially speak out, I've made many enemies. I would say from school institutions to city officials. I even have somebody who's run for governor multiple times who does not like me. But
Doing something right then.
well, I feel like I really do have a very strong like sense of where we need to go and how we need to get there.
Mhm.
And so if you are somebody who's going to essentially keep pushing that narrative forward and you're going to work to really like better our people, then I'm going to be behind you 100%, and you and I will never have problems. But if you're somebody who's going to like constantly be in the way, or who can't really like who can't really respect Indigenous voices, or specifically Indigenous female voices, then I'm probably gonna rub you the wrong way. But so I would like to think that a lot of the times though when I've stepped up, it's always been out of necessity,
Mhm.
not necessarily because I was like looking to take on that role, but like even with Westwin, I was the only one who would step up and actually organize as a whole. Everyone wanted to organize their individual piece of it and had what they could contribute, what their gift was, and what they could contribute to the movement, but they didn't necessarily know how to put it all together as one moving piece. And
Mm.
so that's where I come in. So I feel like neurodivergency, there's a genetic aspect and then necessity.
I'm here for it. I'm here for it. you've made such an impact already, and this is just one phase of a whole life of work that you're engaged in that is intergenerational. You know, you're carrying the torch of your ancestors. I do think it's so wild how you have such a soft spoken voice, and they just have no idea the fire beneath that.
That's honestly why I think that I fuck them up a lot, or why, like, I shake them, because I will get in front of them and I will definitely tell them to their faces exactly how I feel. Like, you can literally go on any of our social medias and you can go on any of the city council websites and you will definitely be able to find video of me telling them how I feel. But I always do it with facts. I always do it in a calm, even keeled tone. But again, that's because of the way that I grew up. You know, you couldn't be the angry Indian woman. You couldn't be the angry native. If you were the angry native, then you were seen as a savage. Like, if you were the angry woman, then it was like you're just being a bitch. And so it was like I had to learn how to essentially like mold myself into something that they couldn't fight back against. And I feel like a lot of that really started when I was younger. My grandpa, like, he said that I would always run around and like scream and yell, and like I was one of the loudest kids in the hall. And so he said finally one day he'd stop me and he was like, you know, you don't always have to yell. You don't always have to scream. You can just talk to people. And if they actually want to hear what you have to say, they will listen and they will hear you. And so I feel like he said that to me not because he really wanted me to like dim my light, but I feel like he understood that there were going to be moments where I needed to be able to be soft spoken. And that sometimes in those moments when it's quiet and when we are soft spoken, that's when people really hear us. Um, so he taught me that there's a duality with it. And so I do think that there are ways to bring the spice and the fire, but how I am with my friends is not necessarily how I come at city council. It's definitely with the same amount of passion, but less cuss words,
Right.
unfortunately.
Mhm. It's about being strategic.
Yes, very strategic. Which honestly, like when you know, we had a situation where we had been calling them out at city council for ignoring us as with really as citizens, but also the Indigenous voice. And I don't think we got to this earlier, but one of the reasons why we say that is because our city as a whole never legitimately voted on the project for Westwin. Essentially, what the city did was they passed what's known as a capital improvements plan or a capital improvements project. And so within that, they told us that it was going to be about parks and like roads and infrastructure and things like that. And what they did was they put a little column in there that was like industrial development. And so we didn't know what that looked like. They didn't tell us any plans for what industrial development meant. And then essentially once it got passed, then that's when they said, oh, by the way, Blueberry Park, we're going to do that.
No, that feels like a violation of open meetings.
Well, so I've looked into it, and essentially because of the way that they did the budget, it's not, because they didn't break it down for anything. They said, we're going to do X amount of money to parks. We're going to do X amount to streets. And then we're going to do X amount to industrial development. And so us as citizens, you know, we're trusting our city leaders to essentially like you know, go with what we believe is right. And that at least if there's a misunderstanding or a difference of opinion, that there will be conversations had and that real change would be, you know, made from those. And then that just wasn't what happened. But so we had been calling our city leaders out about that for a really long time. And then I guess one of them got upset. And so he's the former Ward 2 councilman, Kelly Harris. But so basically, they always go through the same, like, I guess, procedure when you are, when they're doing city council meetings. So they always go through like their welcome or their invocation, the pledge, and then they do like present an award to a citizen. They do an employee spotlight, and then eventually they get to a section called reports, which is supposed to be where essentially every council member will give a report of what's going on in their ward and then what can be expected to happen in their ward for that month. So they do basically like past events and then upcoming events. And then just anything like sometimes you might hear them be like, "Hey, stop speeding through the neighborhood over there off of," like, or sometimes it might be, "Hey, we're gonna have a Juneteenth barbecue Q&A. Come over to the block and let me know what's going on. If y'all wanna talk to me about your concerns, now's the time to do it. Meet me down the street."
Mhm.
So it could be something like that. But what it's not supposed to be is what Kelly Harris did, which is he essentially got up there and he said, "Listen, y'all are telling us about all of the atrocities that we're committing against Indigenous people, but what y'all not realizing is," and then he went on to name the percentage of natives that die by suicide, the percentage of natives that die by overdose, and the percentage of natives that died by alcoholism or died from alcoholism. And essentially, what he said was, "This is the damage that y'all are doing to yourselves. So y'all don't need to be worried about what we're doing to Westwin. Instead, y'all should don't be worrying about the plank in my or about the splinter in my eye when you got a plank in yours,"
Mhm.
kind of thing. And I think that was like his exact wording on that one. But so and then he was like, um, if you want to have a conversation with us, then I'm sure anyone up here would be willing to have a conversation with you, including me. And then he was like, "Even though it doesn't happen very often, occasionally I do change my mind." Yeah.
Who
And
are
then
you,
he,
bro?
for real. But then he basically was like, if you are just gonna sit at home on social media, then I don't have use for you. If you're just sitting at home in your grandma's basement, he was like, then I don't have any use for you. But if you really want to have a conversation, then we can have a conversation. So they fucked up because I was the first audience participation that they called after he did all of that.
Oh my god.
And so I got up there and I was like, contrary to popular belief, I'm actually not at home in my grandmother's basement. I'm a homeowner in the city in which you claim to represent, and I'm here. So while I'm here, let's talk about it. And so I basically then just went in and talked about Westman and what they've been doing and blah blah blah. But so it's like even in those moments when it's like I go up there and I say those things to respond to him, I could have gotten mad, I could have cussed him out, I could have called him this and that, and I wouldn't have been wrong. It
Mhm.
wouldn't have been a lie, but I wouldn't have been allowed back into City Hall for 30 days, 60 days, whatever it is. They made a new rule now that, because that's what they do. They change rules now that we're involved. And so if you get escorted out because of decorum issues, then you're banned for 30 days or 60 days or something like that. Yeah.
That's interesting. I wonder, was that after Sean Day was escorted out by police because of speaking out against Westwind?
So Shonda wasn't the only one who was escorted out by
Right.
police. Shonda was the one that they were focused on. But really anyone in the area who was chanting got escorted out. That's why after she leaves, you see him still standing there telling us to leave.
Yeah.
And then you have that picture where it's basically me staring at that police officer. That's because he was telling me that I had to leave. But we saw this. We saw a kind of an uptick in it after that for sure, but also what I didn't know was happening at the time was that there's another group in town that's been organizing called Whistleblower Voices. And so they've been raising awareness about a lot of the craziness that's been happening. And so what we realized afterwards was that it was a culmination of the craziness that was going on with the whistleblower voices and with us.
Mhm.
Um, Initially, we did think that it was just, but I will say that there have been other things that have happened that it's been immediate responses to what we tried to push forward, or I guess how we've pushed forward our narrative. But yeah, so they like to change up the rules. But so if I would have been explosive or if I would have gotten escorted out, then I would have been banned for 60 days. They could have done anything in those 60 days and I wouldn't have been able to be there to be a voice to say, "Hey, don't fucking do that." So it's like you have to play their game a little bit in that way.
The way you just explained that, I think about in my shoes, if he was talking about black on black crime or something, and I don't know how I would have responded. You are your ancestors' wildest dreams because it takes tact and discipline to do what you did. So I have one last question for you, Kaysa. We just got a minute left. What's next for the resistance?
So we definitely have a couple of events coming up. So we have a mutual aid event that's happening at Elmer Thomas Park. It's coming up at the end of the month. We'll start putting stuff on our socials up about it soon. And then we are currently working toward, so we got a grant to get a legal assessment done. And so what we are looking for now is an Indigenous lawyer or an attorney who would be willing to do the legal assessment for us. And then we are also looking to find an Indigenous attorney who would be willing to represent us if it were to eventually go to court. For right now, it would need to be somebody who is barred in the state of Oklahoma because that's where we are. But once it becomes a federal case, then eventually we could open it up to anyone.
So y'all ain't playing, and I'm here for
Mm-mm.
it. Kaysa Whitley, Kiowa, an absentee Shawnee citizen, coordinator for Westwin Resistance. Thank you so much for joining In Depth with Dion.
Thank you for having me.
For this week's Community Spotlight, I spoke with tech entrepreneur and investor Chandler Malone for an in-depth conversation about leadership, innovation, and the opportunities in the tech industry. Check out what he had to say.
One of the things that I've noticed in this age of AI is not only that, folks have an opportunity to leverage AI for themselves, but also we really have not yet seen the job loss that will come from AI. And for people to actually be able to protect themselves economically, they need to be able to learn and find out how to build their own businesses for themselves.
Economic independence at a time where we are seeing mass layoffs on the federal level. There are already indicators that we are entering a recession. So there's no telling how much of an impact it's going to have on the private sector. As someone in the tech space, in the AI space, what do you see happening? What do you think is about to happen?
Yeah. So the first thing that I want to say for folks is companies legally are required to do their fiduciary responsibility, which is to maximize shareholder returns, maximize shareholder value. It is against the law for companies not to do that. And so, if a company has a way to get work done more efficiently, right, at a lower cost to a higher degree of quality, they are always going to take that. And, that's not a moral argument. That's like the way that our country has been set up. That is the company's duty. And so, with that being said, right, it's like there's going to be, more and more job loss. But also, individuals have a level of subject matter expertise in what they have been working on and what they have been studying and what they have been operating in and doing, for the past decade of their life.
That's all for now. Thank you so much for joining us on In Depth with Dion. Watch on YouTube, on Substack for exclusive and behind the scenes content, or listen anywhere you get your podcasts. This episode is presented by Afropop Company, Oklahoma's only Black-owned soda company. And special thanks to our producer, Jesse Ulrich of Pod for Good Media. I'm Dion Osborne. Stay woke.